An hour after I gave birth to our son, my husband entered my hospital room with his pregnant partner and said, "We're expecting another addition to the family." What his father did next left everyone speechless. 58 minutes. That's how old my son was when my husband walked into my hospital room holding another woman's hand. I wish I could say I saw it coming. I didn't. I was still in the gown with the snap collar, still had an IV taped to the back of my hand, still had that hollowed out feeling behind my ribs that nobody warns you about. Not pain exactly, just the echo of where pain used to be. My son, Elliot, was asleep against my chest, one fist curled by his cheek the way newborns do, like they're still holding on to whatever they left behind. Byron stopped at the foot of my bed like he was checking into a hotel, calm, unhurried, like nothing about that moment required urgency. "This is Mary," he said. "Our family is growing again." I laughed, one short ugly sound because for half a second I thought I'd misheard him. 31 hours without sleep, an epidural still working its way out of my legs. Then I saw her stomach. She was pregnant, not early. Showing, the kind of showing where strangers start asking about the due date. Nobody moved, not the nurse adjusting my IV line. Not Mary, whose hand hung half raised where Byron had just let it drop. Not me. That's the part I still think about. Not what he said. How long the room stayed frozen after he said it. "The baby is mine," Byron said, nodding at Mary's belly, like I'd asked. I looked at the clock above the door. 11:42 a.m. My son was 58 minutes old. "How long, Byron? This isn't the time, Shay. How long?" Mary pulled her hand out of his. "You said we'd tell her alone." "Not now," Byron snapped. That's when I understood he hadn't stumbled into this moment. He'd built it. He'd waited until I was sore and drained and too weak to stand, until my body had nothing left to fight with, and then he'd walked in and said his line like he'd rehearsed it, because he had. Men don't sound that steady unless they've practiced it somewhere else first. I need to back up because none of what happened next makes sense unless you understand what I'd already survived to get to that hospital bed. I'd been a paralegal for 8 years by the time Elliot was born, working family law cases at a small firm downtown, Corrigan and Blake, divorce filings, custody modifications, the occasional contested will. I built exhibit binders for a living. I knew what a chain of custody was before I ever needed one for my own marriage, and there's a bitter kind of comedy in that, in spending 8 years organizing other people's worst days and thinking mine would never look like theirs. Byron and I met at a mutual friend's engagement party 11 years ago. He worked for his father's company, Whitfield & Sons Construction, a mid-sized outfit that built custom homes across 3 counties, and he had that easy, room-filling charm that made you feel like the only person he was talking to, even in a crowd. His father, Thomas, had built the company from a single crew and a used flatbed truck in 1987. Byron was supposed to inherit it. We got married 2 years later. For the next 5 years, we tried to have a baby. And when I say tried, I mean we spent thousands of dollars and worse. We spent hope over and over on rounds of IVF that didn't take. Byron held my hand through every failed transfer. He drove me to appointments at 6 a.m. He cried with me in the parking lot the day our doctor finally called and said the numbers looked good. He knew exactly what that baby cost me. He knew, and he still did what he did. For most of those 10 years, I would have told you we were happy, or at least happy enough, which is its own kind of lie people tell themselves without noticing. Byron was the one who remembered my coworkers' names, who could talk to my mother for an hour about nothing and leave her laughing. At company barbecues, he'd introduce me to his father's crew as the reason I stopped being an idiot, and everyone would laugh, and I'd feel, for a second, like I'd won something. I didn't know yet that charm like that isn't proof of character. Sometimes it's just proof of practice. Looking back, there were things I should have caught. A receipt for 2 dinners the same week he told me he was working late with a client. A missed call from a number I didn't recognize. Logged at 1:14 a.m. that he said was a wrong number. I told myself it was nothing because a woman 8 months pregnant with a baby she'd fought 5 years for does not have room in her chest for suspicion. I made room for hope instead. That was my mistake, if you want to call it one. I don't, not really. Hope isn't a character flaw. It's just expensive when someone spends it against you. Back in that hospital room, none of that history mattered yet. What mattered was the 4 of us, and the baby who didn't know any of it was happening. "How far along are you?" I asked Mary. She wouldn't look at me. "Almost 5 months. 5 months. He'd been with her since before I even knew I was pregnant. Since before the ultrasound where we heard Elliot's heartbeat for the first time and Byron had squeezed my hand so hard it left a mark. I pressed the call button before he could say another word. "Get them out," I told the nurse. "Call security if you have to." That's when Byron's father, Thomas, stepped forward from where he'd been standing by the window. I hadn't even registered him in the room until then. He'd come to meet his grandson, and he was still holding a gift bag he never got to give me, one of those little pale blue ones with tissue paper sticking out the top. His face had gone the color of drywall. "You brought your mistress into her recovery room," Thomas said, "on the day your son was born. I'm his father. I have a right to—" "You have a right to leave," Thomas said. "Now." Something in his voice made even Byron stop arguing. They left, the door shut. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and it took me a full minute to realize it wasn't the hormones. It was rage, arriving late, the way it does when your body's been too busy surviving to feel it in real time. The nurse, her name tag said Denise, and I'll remember that for the rest of my life, pulled a chair beside my bed and didn't say one word about Byron. She just adjusted Elliot's blanket and told me he already knew my voice, that he'd been listening to it for 9 months, and it was the one steady thing in his whole world right now. I held on to that harder than I held on to anything everything else that day. That night, after Elliot was finally asleep in the little bassinet beside my bed, I opened my phone and wrote 3 lines in my notes app. Protect my son. Protect myself. Stop protecting Byron. I didn't know yet what that third line would cost him. I only knew I meant it. I didn't confront Byron again for 6 weeks. I want to be clear about why, because people hear 6 weeks and assume I was slow to act, or worse, that I was waiting to forgive him. I wasn't. I was building a case, the same way I'd built 40 of them for other people's marriages. The difference was that this time, I couldn't afford to be wrong about a single detail, because I only had one shot at doing it right. The first thing I found was a bank statement. Byron and I kept a joint checking account for household bills, and I'd always been the one who reconciled it. An old habit from the job, checking numbers the way other people check locks. 3 days after Elliot came home, still running on 2-hour stretches of sleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and pulled up the last statement, mostly out of muscle memory, mostly to keep my hands busy. There was a transfer I didn't recognize. $4,800 moved out in a single withdrawal to an account ending in 3391. I told myself it was probably a hospital deposit, some pre-authorization for the delivery that hadn't shown up on the itemized bill yet. That's the shape denial takes when you're too exhausted to hold the whole truth at once. You build it a small, survivable lie at a time. I almost closed the laptop right there. Elliot needed a diaper change. My incision still pulled every time I stood up too fast. And some quieter, more tired version of me wanted very badly to just let it be a billing error and go back to bed. But 8 years of reading other people's bank statements had trained a different instinct into my hands, and that instinct opened the next statement instead of closing the first. Then I found the second withdrawal. Same amount, 6 weeks earlier, same account. My hands started shaking before my brain caught up to why. I called the bank's fraud line the next morning, gave them the account number, and asked, as calmly as 8 years of professional training could manage, whether they could tell me anything about where transfers to that account went. They couldn't, not without a subpoena or Byron's own authorization. Fair enough. I hung up and did what I do for a living. I started a file. I confronted him about it that Friday, carefully, testing the water. I noticed some transfers on the joint account. What's account 3391? Work stuff, he said, not looking up from his phone. Reimbursements. I'll clean it up on the next statement. He didn't clean it up. The withdrawals kept coming every few weeks, and I stopped asking. I started tracking instead. The second thing I found, I didn't go looking for. Mary sent it to me. I'll never know exactly what changed in her. Maybe the exhaustion of her own pregnancy. Maybe the slow realization that a man who'd do what Byron did to me would eventually do it to her too. Whatever it was, 4 weeks after the hospital, my phone started buzzing with messages from a number I didn't recognize. Screenshots, voice notes, dates. I almost blocked the number before I opened the first one. I'm glad I didn't. I know you probably hate me, the first message said. I'm not asking you not to. I just think you should know what he told me, because I don't think it's true anymore, and I don't think you know it either. What followed over the next 2 weeks was a timeline, and it was worse than what he'd told me in that hospital room. Byron hadn't met Mary 5 months before Elliot was born. He'd met her 8 months before, which meant he was already seeing her during the final round of IVF, during the appointment where we heard the heartbeat, during the parking lot where he cried with me and told me he'd never wanted anything more in his life. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after I understood that, not moving. Elliot asleep in the bassinet 3 feet away, completely unaware that the math around his own existence had just gotten so much crueler than I'd been told. I went back through the voice notes twice more that night, mostly to check I hadn't misheard the dates the way I'd once misheard "our family is growing again." I hadn't. Mary had even attached a screenshot of an old restaurant reservation, time-stamped 9 months back, at a place across town neither of us had ever been to together. Small, stupid, undeniable. The kind of detail that doesn't lie, because nobody thinks to fake something that boring. I tried to confirm it with Byron directly. One more time, one more test. When did you actually meet Mary? I already told you. Around 5 months ago. He said it without blinking. That was the part that scared me. Not the lie, but how easily it came. I stopped testing him after that. There was no version of this where honesty was coming from his side of the table. The third thing I found took a professional to uncover, and it's the one that turned this from a broken marriage into something closer to a crime. I'd started keeping careful notes. Dates, screenshots, bank statement printouts, all organized the way I'd organize a client's exhibit binder, because I genuinely didn't trust myself to remember which detail came from which week once I was this sleep deprived. When I laid it all out, one number kept nagging at me. $4,800 every few weeks, going out, never coming back. That's not a reimbursement pattern, that's a payment plan. I hired a forensic accountant, Daniel Restrepo, a certified fraud examiner with 14 years tracing exactly this kind of thing for divorce and probate cases. Patricia, my attorney, recommended him. More on her in a minute. Daniel took one look at the pattern and told me what I already suspected, but hadn't let myself say out loud. It looked like structured payments against a line of credit. It took him 9 days to confirm it. Byron had opened a home equity line of credit against our house, the house his father had helped us buy, the down payment a gift from the same trust Thomas had set up years earlier to help his kids get started, for $42,000. He'd used an old power of attorney document, one I'd signed years earlier so Byron could handle paperwork while I was on a work trip, and never thought to revoke, because why would you revoke something you'd forgotten you'd signed? He used it to authorize the HELOC without needing my signature again. The money had gone toward Mary's apartment. First month, last month, a security deposit of $3,100 and furniture. A whole life, quietly assembled, paid for with a gift his father had given us to build our life instead. This isn't just a marital problem anymore, Daniel told me, laying the documents across my kitchen table like exhibits he'd built 100 times before. This touches your father-in-law's trust. He has a right to know what's happened to money he gave in good faith. He walked me through it the way I imagine he'd walk a courtroom through it if it ever came to that. The original POA document, the HELOC application with my name on the authorization line in a signature that was technically mine and nothing else about it. The disbursement schedule that matched, almost to the dollar. The withdrawals I'd already found on my own. People think financial fraud is complicated, Daniel said. It's usually just someone counting on nobody looking. You looked. I sat with that for 2 days before I understood what it meant. Not just that Byron had stolen from me, he'd stolen from his own father, using a piece of paper I'd signed, in a moment of nothing more sinister than convenience, years before either of us knew what it would eventually be used for. The fourth thing I found explained how he'd managed to hide it all for so long, and it made me angrier than almost anything else because it meant more than one person had lied to my face. Byron's co-worker, Kevin Marsh, had been covering for him for the better part of a year. Guys' night. Working the Hendricks site late. Crashed at Kevin's, didn't want to wake you. I'd believed every single one of those texts because Kevin had known Byron since high school, had been in our wedding, had held my hand at the hospital the week before Elliot was born, and told me everything was going to be fine. Mary's messages confirmed it without my even needing to ask. Kevin's apartment had been the meeting place more than once. Kevin had known about Mary for months. There was a night I remembered clearly now with the new information laid over it. A Tuesday, 4 months before Elliot was born, when Byron texted that he was helping Kevin move a couch and wouldn't be home until midnight. I remembered because I'd sent back a photo of the nursery paint swatches, 3 shades of pale green, asking which one he liked. He'd replied with a thumbs up 20 minutes later. I found out later there was no couch. I didn't confront Kevin. There was no version of that conversation that would give me anything useful, and I'd learned by then that every early confrontation just taught Byron what I knew and gave him time to build a better lie around it. So I wrote it down instead, dated it, filed it, and kept my face as ordinary as I could manage the next time Kevin came by the house to drop off a gift for Elliot, like nothing in the world was wrong. That was the hardest performance of the whole 6 weeks. Not the crying, the smiling. By the start of week 5, I wasn't handling this alone anymore, and I want to be honest that I couldn't have. I'm a paralegal, not an attorney, and there's an ethical wall there I take seriously. My own firm couldn't represent me, conflict of interest, so I hired Patricia Nkemelu, a family law attorney with 19 years of practice, most of it in cases involving hidden assets and fault-based divorce. Patricia laid it out plainly at our first meeting. What you have, she said, sliding my folder back across her desk, is enough for a fault-based filing, marital waste claims against the HELOC funds, and depending on how your father-in-law's trust was structured, possibly a separate civil claim tied to the misuse of that power of attorney. That's not nothing, Shay. That's a case. She also told me the part I didn't want to hear, that I needed to wait. The moment he knows you know, he starts protecting himself instead of exposing himself. Let him think he's still getting away with it. That's when people make their worst, most useful mistakes. Her office was small and plainly furnished, no leather and brass, just a wall of case law binders and a framed photo of her own 2 kids on the desk. And something about its ordinariness made it easier to sit there and say things out loud that I still hadn't said to anyone but a phone screen. She asked good questions, not how do you feel, but what does the trust document actually say about revocation? Who else had access to that account? Did Kevin ever sign anything, even informally, related to the apartment? By the end of that first hour, my kitchen table folder had a name. She called it a case file, the same term I'd used for other people's marriages for 8 years, and hearing it applied to mine made the whole thing feel both more real and, strangely, more survivable. So I waited. I let Byron keep planning the vow renewal he still thought was happening. The one he'd booked, ironically, the same month Mary got pregnant, as if some part of him needed the performance of commitment precisely because he'd already abandoned it. I let him pick out cufflinks. I let him rehearse a toast in the bathroom mirror, half a page of notes on his phone that started with, 10 years ago, I married my best friend. I read that draft over his shoulder once and had to leave the room so he wouldn't see my face. Somewhere in the middle of all this, I also started seeing a therapist, Dr. Elaine Cho, a licensed marriage and family therapist with 22 years of practice, someone Corrigan and Blake had referred clients to for years. I wasn't looking for permission to do what I was already doing. I was looking for a way to survive doing it without losing whatever part of myself would need to raise Elliot afterward. You're allowed to want accountability, Dr. Cho told me in the plain, unhurried way she said most things. Just be careful what you're chasing underneath it. If it's justice, you'll feel steadier once it's done. If it's revenge dressed up as justice, you'll feel emptier, because revenge never actually fills the hole it promises to fill. She also asked me more than once whether I was sleeping, whether I was eating anything besides toast standing over the sink, whether I had anyone besides Elliot to talk to at 3 a.m. when the folder started feeling less like evidence and more like the only thing keeping me upright. I didn't always have good answers. She never let that stop the sessions from being useful anyway. Some weeks we spent the whole hour just on how to keep breathing through the 6 weeks, and only at the very end end did she circle back to the plan itself? I thought about that more than I told her. The fifth thing I found last, and it was the one that changed everything about how I understood that day in the hospital. Mary sent it to me 11 days before the vow renewal, almost apologetically, like she'd been holding on to it and finally lost the strength to keep holding. It was a text Byron had sent her the night before I went into labor. "Tomorrow's the day, probably," it read. "Going to tell Shay about us right after while she's still out of it. Best time to do it. She won't have the energy to make a scene, and my dad will be there so it won't drag out. Rip the band-aid off once." I read it 4 times before I could breathe normally again. It wasn't an affair that got discovered at a bad time. It was a plan. He had scheduled the worst moment of my life to make his own life easier, and he had done the math on my exhaustion the way you'd calculate a discount. I brought it to Patricia the next morning. She read it once, set it down, and looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. "This," she said, tapping the printout, "is the piece that changes the tone of everything. This isn't infidelity anymore. This is premeditated cruelty, and courts and rooms full of people, for that matter, respond very differently to premeditation than they do to a mistake." The vow renewal was scheduled for Saturday at 4. By Thursday night, I had 24 hours left to get everything in place, and every piece of it had to land at once or none of it would matter. Patricia needed the final documentation packet printed and organized by Friday afternoon. Daniel needed his forensic report finished and notarized so it could stand on its own if anyone challenged it later. I needed to quietly reissue the guest list. The reception hall wasn't going to seat the people Byron had invited to celebrate him. It was going to seat the people who deserved to hear the truth. My sister, a few of our closest friends who'd stood by me without knowing why I'd gone quiet for 6 weeks, Patricia, Daniel, and, after 2 agonizing days of deciding whether it was fair to him, Thomas. I told Thomas 2 days before the event. Not everything. Enough. The HELOC, the power of attorney, the trust. I watched a man who'd built a company out of a single flatbed truck go completely silent for almost a minute, staring at the documents like they were written in a language he'd have to relearn to understand. "He used my trust," Thomas said finally. "Not a question. I'm sorry. I didn't want you to find out like this. You didn't do this to me," he said. He did. That was the closest either of us came to crying in that conversation, and neither of us actually did. We just sat there, 2 people who'd both been quietly robbed by the same man, deciding what to do about it. Friday afternoon, the notary Daniel used called to confirm his report was finalized and stamped. One thing, at least, that could no longer fall apart. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone to my ear with one hand and bouncing Elliot with the other, and feeling for about 10 seconds something close to relief before my mind immediately moved on to the next thing that could still go wrong. Friday night at 11:40, Kevin texted Mary, not knowing she and I were in contact, asking if she was coming to Byron's thing Saturday. Mary forwarded it to me instantly, panicking that Kevin might tip Byron off that something was different about the guest list. My stomach dropped so fast I actually sat down on the nursery floor. I texted Patricia at midnight, which I'd promised myself I wouldn't do, and she texted back within 4 minutes. "Mary hasn't confirmed anything to Kevin. Nothing's changed. Breathe." I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the nursery with Elliot against my chest at 2:47 a.m., rocking him in the dark, running through every version of what could go wrong, and made myself one promise. However Saturday went, Elliot would not be in that room to see it. My sister Renee agreed to keep him at her house for the afternoon. That part, at least, I never had to negotiate with myself. The reception hall filled up on Saturday at 3:45, except the guest list wasn't the one Byron was expecting, and neither was the reason everyone had come. He walked in wearing the suit he'd had tailored for a vow renewal to a wife he'd already betrayed twice, and for about 4 seconds he looked genuinely happy. The last 4 seconds, I think, that he ever spent believing his version of events was still intact. Then he scanned the room. Wrong faces in the wrong seats. No banner with our names on it. Patricia sitting near the front with a folder in her lap. Daniel beside her. His own father, standing at the head table instead of sitting, watching him with an expression Byron had clearly never seen aimed at himself before. His smile started to slip. "Shay, what is this?" I stood up. Every head in that hall turned toward me. "You wanted the truth to come out at a good time, Byron," I said. "You just didn't get to pick which one." I opened the folder. "Everyone here is going to hear exactly what you did in that hospital room, and exactly what you did 5 months before it." Byron's face went pale. "Shay, don't." I looked down at the first page. "Let's start with the message you sent Mary the night before our son was born." I read it out loud. All of it. Rip the band-aid off once. I watched 30-some faces rearrange themselves in real time. Watched the last of the room's goodwill toward Byron evaporate somewhere around the phrase, "She won't have the energy to make a scene." I didn't stop there, because Patricia had been right. The pieces only mattered together. I laid out the timeline Mary had confirmed, 8 months instead of 5. The pregnancy that had started while Byron was still holding my hand through a failed transfer. I laid out the $4,800 withdrawals, the HELOC, the $42,000 that had quietly become an apartment and a life for someone else. Daniel stood briefly, credentials and all, 14 years certified fraud examiner, and confirmed in about 90 seconds that every figure in the folder had been independently verified and notarized. Nobody in that room could call it a scorned wife's exaggeration after that. It was documentation. It was Exhibit A through Exhibit F, laid out exactly the way I'd been trained to lay out somebody else's worst day, except this time, it was mine. Mary sat near the back, one hand resting on her own stomach, and and didn't defend him. She didn't need to say anything. She'd already said all of it weeks earlier to me. Then Thomas stood up. The room, which had already gone fairly quiet, went completely still. I built this company from one truck, Thomas said, and his voice didn't shake even once. I set up a family trust so my children could start their lives without the struggles I had starting mine. I gave part of that trust, in good faith, to help my son and his wife buy a home to raise their family in. He turned to look at Byron directly. You used a piece of paper meant to help you protect this family, to fund the family you were building behind its back. You didn't just betray your wife in that hospital room. You stole from the one thing I built to make sure none of you would ever have to struggle the way I did. He reached into his jacket and set an envelope on the table in front of him. Papers Patricia had helped him prepare 2 days earlier, once he'd understood what needed to happen. As of this morning, you are removed as successor and beneficiary of the Whitfield Family Trust, effective immediately. Your interest in Whitfield and Sons transfers to a guardianship trust for your son, administered by his mother until he's old enough to decide what he wants to do with it himself. Nobody in that hall said a word. I don't think anyone breathed for a few seconds. Byron opened his mouth twice and didn't manage anything either time. You have a right to leave, Thomas said. The same 5 words he'd said in that hospital room, almost exactly, except this time there was nothing left underneath them for Byron to argue with. Now, Byron left. Nobody stopped him and nobody needed to. 2 people from the venue staff, arranged quietly in advance by Patricia in case things escalated, stood near the doors the whole time and were never needed for anything more than opening them. The divorce was finalized 5 months later, fault-based on the grounds Patricia had outlined that first day in her office, with the documented marital waste from the HELOC factored heavily into the asset division. I kept the house. Byron kept significantly less than he'd expected to, and considerably less standing in a family that had, for the first time in his life, chosen someone else over him. He still sees Elliot. I made sure of that, not because he'd earned it, but because a 2-year-old shouldn't inherit his father's consequences along with his father's absence. Supervised, structured, on a schedule that Patricia helped draft carefully enough that neither of us has ever had to argue about it since. Thomas sees Elliot more, if I'm honest. Every other Sunday, sometimes more, always with the gift bag habit he never broke. Still pale blue, still tissue paper sticking out the top. Kevin stopped coming around. I never found out if that was guilt or just the natural erosion of a friendship built on a lie. I didn't chase an answer. Some accounts don't need closing statements. Mary had her daughter in the spring. I don't know her well, and I'm not sure I ever will, but she sent me one more message after the divorce was final. No confession this time, no evidence, just 4 words. I hope you're okay. I didn't answer right away. Eventually, I did. 2 words. Getting there. Dr. Cho was right in the end about the thing she'd warned me to watch for. There was no triumphant high after that reception hall, no permanent lightness, just a kind of steadiness that took a few months to settle in and never fully announced itself when it finally did. Elliot is walking now. He has Byron's stubborn chin and, as far as I can tell, absolutely nothing else of his. He falls asleep the same way he did the day he was born, one fist curled by his cheek, like he's still holding on to something. I still have those 3 lines saved in my notes app. I never deleted them. Protect my son, protect myself, stop protecting Byron. I did all 3, eventually, in that order, though it took longer than I expected and cost more than I budgeted for. The last one turned out to be the hardest, not because I loved him too much to let go, but because I'd spent 10 years mistaking my own silence for peace. It never was. It was just quiet. There's a difference. I know it now the way you know a scar, not because it still hurts, but because you remember exactly where it came from every time you look at it.